If there is one thing that I believe defines the Final Fantasy franchise, is this overall idea of what I would call a collective spirituality. This theme has always been central to the series, a theme where fate, power, and existence itself are all tied to something that is greater than just one person. However, this has shifted in the last entries of Final Fantasy 15 and 16, where we actually see a much more individualistic spirituality being taken. What was once really about the we is now just about the me. By collective spirituality, what I'm trying to refer to here is this belief that destiny is shaped through unity. And this unity in Final Fantasy is very much represented by this journey that is shared with a party, and this idea that overcoming fate requires people coming together. This theme defined the series for decades. But in Final Fantasy 15 and 16, even though destiny is definitely still a central theme in the story, it is no longer about a collective struggle. Or at the very least, the focus shifts heavily on a single protagonist. In this case, Noctis and Clive, whose personal burdens and individual power are the things that really define the narrative. While Clive in Final Fantasy 16 is surrounded by allies like Cid, Jill, Gav, and Joshua, the story is ultimately his alone. The same applies to Noctis in Final Fantasy 15. Compare this to, for example, Final Fantasy 10, where even Tidus famously says, "This is my story." Yet in reality, Final Fantasy X makes it clear plenty of times that Tidus's journey is not just about him. When he says "this is my story," feels to me like he is saying this is the story of Yuna, of Auron, of Riku, of the entire squad, and the collective will of Spira, a world that wants change. His story is their story. Clive and Noctis, however, embody narratives of personal struggle, revenge, and redemption. Even though these games featured party members, their final confrontation tells a very different story. Traditionally, in nearly every single mainline entry Final Fantasy game, the final battle is fought together with your party. Yet in Final Fantasy 15 and 16, the final battles are entirely solitary. The protagonist, now overwhelmingly powerful, stands alone against a godlike entity. Clive, having absorbed the power of every icon, defeats the very being that created them. Noctis, wielding the strength of the past kings, sacrifices himself to destroy Ardyn even in the afterlife. These games shift heavily the focus to a much more individualistic autonomy, self-reliance, and personal destiny over a collective fate. It is ironic to me that Final Fantasy XVI, despite drawing clear inspirations from Game of Thrones in its grounded political conflicts, ultimately becomes at times one of the most over-the-top fantastical Final Fantasy games. The comparisons to games like Azura's Wrath are pretty legit. Clive amasses immense power and single-handedly changes the world. But is this really what Final Fantasy is about? Could characters like Cloud, Yuna, Terra, Zidane, could they actually be successful without their party? Final Fantasy VI, which is widely regarded as one of the best entries of this series, while Terra is often seen as the protagonist, Final Fantasy VI does not have a singular main character in the traditional sense. Instead, it tells the story of a group of people with individual struggles who unite against a force that is greater than any singular one of them. This game, more than any other in the franchise, embodies this essence of a Final Fantasy collective spirit better than anyone. The same happens from Final Fantasy VII all the way to Final Fantasy XIII, I would argue, even though we do now have a much more defined main character in all of these games. And to be honest, that was probably a good decision, because in Final Fantasy VI, it's kind of hard at times to identify with one specific character, and I feel like at times you always kind of need that. But the focus is always in all of these games, at one point or another, in every single one of these party members. All of their stories, all of their point of views and perspectives matter in the overarching story. The collective group, rather than just the protagonist, becomes the driving force of the narrative, all the way to the very end, and they help reinforce this idea of a collective spirit that has been central to the Final Fantasy legacy. I mentioned this in my last video, and I'm sticking with that idea. But I truly believe that the type of gameplay you end up choosing for your video game shapes the type of story it can be delivered. A third-person, action-oriented combat system that focuses heavily on a single protagonist will never effectively convey the idea of a collective struggle. Imagine if Final Fantasy XVI was actually a turn-based combat system, where Clive, Jill, Cid, Joshua, and many others could band together to fight enemies, even combining their econ powers like in Chrono Trigger with dual and triple tech abilities. Mechanics like those actually highlight group collaboration, a theme that is difficult if not impossible to emphasize in a fully action-based game that centers around one protagonist, as we see in Final Fantasy 15 and 16. This idea of a collective struggle is obviously not unique in the Final Fantasy franchise. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo may be the central figure, but his journey would be impossible without Sam, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Gandalf, and countless others. The destruction of the One Ring is Frodo's burden, but it is not an act of individual heroism. It is the result of a shared burden. Even Berserk, a manga that deeply focuses on Guts' personal struggle, recognizes this. Kentaro Miura shows a version of Guts that is incredibly individualistic in the beginning, but as time goes by, more and more companions join the ranks, and we understand that all of these characters have a role in this party. Guts slowly realizes that being alone will never really make him achieve his objectives in the long run, and all of these people that are now behind him make his journey much more possible. Do Final Fantasy 15 and 16 have supporting characters? Of course they do, but ultimately, in the end, we are the chosen one. The responsibility to change the world is placed entirely on Clive and Noctis, transforming them into almost mythic figures, solitary warriors who amass godlike power to reshape destiny. And at its core, what is the message that a Final Fantasy story wants to deliver to us? Like, what is the end game? The series is, at the end of the day, deeply rooted in Buddhist, Shinto, and Hinduist ideas of interconnected fate. Philosophies that heavily focus on this whole thing of an equilibrium between personal ambition and being a part of a community of people. This series has always evolved, both in gameplay and storytelling. And heck, you, me, and everyone at a certain point in time, we didn't really enjoy a certain evolutions of the franchise. And that's fine. But at the end of the day, this is a story about people that strive for change. A change that cannot really be achieved alone, but through the combined efforts of many. And it needs to be showcased in that manner. Together until the end, no matter what happens, in both psychological and physical form. That is, in my view, one of the biggest problems of Final Fantasy 15 and 16. These are essentially lone wolf games, in every sense of the word. And honestly, I love those types of lone wolf stories. You have no idea. It's my favorite sort of trope in video games. But this is not what Final Fantasy is about. These two games are replacing the collectivist ideals of past entries with a narrative that is much more of individual power. In these two games, a single figure alone shapes destiny. My question to you guys is this really the direction that we want to see for this franchise? Is this really the lesson that this franchise wants to teach us? Should it be from now on about lone heroes? Or should it be about the bonds between people that make change possible? I don't know, man. I feel like, Final Fantasy 12, 13, and all the past games, even Final Fantasy 8, all of those games had issues. But at the end of the day, those games were always about the we, the collective coming together to face a bigger threat. And one thing that I am sure is that the me can never and will never replace the we.